Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will deliver a speech tonight arguing his case for The Voice. He will say that it will be a positive change that will last for generations and an act of faith and love. The Prime Minister will also take aim at opponents of the Indigenous voice, calling them chicken littles of the past. Joining me now to discuss this is the most highly esteemed and respected political journalist in the country, Editor-at-Large of The Australian, Paul Kelly. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Paul. Before we speak about The Voice and your weekend piece, I just want to ask your reflections on Mark McGowan, his resignation just this afternoon, and the legacy he leaves as Premier in WA.
Very good to be with you, Shari. Mark McGowan's had an extraordinary career. He is the most popular political leader in Australia today. His achievements as a Premier in both political and policy terms are extraordinary. He's been not only very successful at the state level in the West, where he's virtually eliminated the Liberal Party from the state parliament, but he was fundamental to Anthony Albanese's election victory in May 2022, because there were essentially two elections held then. There was an election in the West and there was an election in the rest of the country. And it was the Federal Labor's performance in the West which underpinned Anthony Albanese's success. So I think in that sense, McGowan's influence has been enormous. The politics of the pandemic were fundamental for McGowan. There weren't lockdowns in the West. He shut the border. He played to the sense of protecting the West from the pandemic, and there's absolutely no doubt at all. The people of Western Australia felt this enormous sense of gratitude towards McGowan, concern and hostility towards Scott Morrison.
Yeah. Now, I want to turn to the column, your extraordinary column on The Voice that you wrote in the Weekend Australian about The Voice. And look, we are seeing the start of a very divisive debate. You are a deep thinker, Paul Kelly. You write in your piece that Labor is putting a radical model of The Voice that divides the nation on principle, morality and equality. And that in his speech on the referendum bill just last Thursday, Albanese was aggressive and political.
The first point to make, Shari, is that reconciliation must be based on unity. It must be based on bringing people together. We've been talking about this for the last 30 or 40 years. And the Reconciliation Council a number of years ago, when he talked about the principles that should underpin The Voice, highlighted the fact that to be successful, The Voice has got to unite the country. It's got to bring people together. Well, where are we now? This proposal, this referendum, is extremely divisive. We can see this. It's permeating all aspects of our national life in a very divisive way. We know that the opposition is formally opposed to it. And what we see, I think, is a collection of elites coming together, business, corporate, finance, sporting organisations, university, large parts of the media, attempting to persuade the Australian people or perhaps intimidate the Australian people. And I think there's a sense of suspicion on the part of the public about what's going on here. But the first point to make is that this proposal is incredibly divisive. Now, that shouldn't happen. This debate should be based on a proposal which has got the capacity to bring the country together. So this is the first point of failure.
Yeah. Look, these are very strong words when you talk about the intimidation of the public, people, pressure on them to go along with this. Look, you also make the point in your editorial, you say, don't be fooled by constant assurances reminiscent of Joh Bjelke-Petersen that there's nothing to see here. There's everything to see here. You write The Voice is about power. Do you think this is one of the failures of the government so far, that it hasn't properly explained to the public to which policy areas, to which topics the Voice to Parliament would apply, how this power would be applied?
Well, it's sad to say, it's not just that the government hasn't explained it. The government, as I argue in the piece, is waging a campaign of deception. Now, there are 3 points to make about this. This referendum is about recognition and it's about the Voice to Parliament. And the heart of it is the voice to Parliament. There are many ways in which you can recognise the Indigenous peoples. Essentially, if you look at what the government says in the Yes campaign, it's all about recognition, and they don't want to talk about the voice. Well, that is misleading, and that is an act of deception. Secondly, if we look at the nature of the voice, the voice essentially is an institution that is a group rights body that goes into the Constitution that can make recommendations across the entire board, across the entire scope of government decision-making and parliamentary decision-making. Yet what we're told by the government is there's nothing to see here. This is just an act of politeness. Well, this is not a modest proposal. The proposal I've just described is not a modest proposal. It can't be seen as that. Again, that is misleading. Now, I think the final point to make about this is that people argue this is simply about the Indigenous peoples. There's no racial element here. Well, again, I think that's misleading. If we're to be frank about this, the voice represents Indigenous Australians, but it's also, in terms of definition, got a racial component. So the voice is both. It both represents Indigenous Australians, in that sense it's highly appropriate, but it also has a racial dimension. And we've got to be honest and frank about that. And again, if you look at what the government says about that, it's also misleading.
Look, we're almost out of time, but look, I just want to ask you, do you think Anthony Albanese has taken the wrong approach here? And if he would have chosen a less ambitious model, or even just recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution, we'd be looking at a different outcome in the referendum, because the polls currently show that support is falling. While it's still in a winning position, you know, the trajectory is that it's falling.
Well, I'm tempted to agree with what you've just said, and that's the thrust of my argument in the article I wrote at the weekend. But the point I would make is that Anthony Albanese can only put a referendum that has the support of the Indigenous leaders. This is a fundamental point. And so what happened a number of years ago...
held hostage to them, basically.
Well, what happened a number of years ago was the Indigenous leaders made it absolutely clear that they wanted the voice. Then there was a debate about the nature of the voice, and what we've got is a voice that is a very substantial change to the Constitution. I mean, I would be happy to accept a voice that was a far more modest proposal, but we don't have that. We've got, as I say, a group rights body being put into the Constitution that has the capacity to make recommendations across the entire ambit of policy, not just policies concerning Indigenous peoples, policies of general application as well, both in terms of the executive government and in terms of the Parliament. Now, that is a very substantial change to the Constitution, and the heart of this referendum, as I argue, is we've got to look at the words. We've got to look at the words that go into the Constitution, the power that's been created, and assess that in terms of what it means, changing our Constitution and changing our system of governance. We've got to evaluate the issue at that level.
All right. Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at The Australian, an honour to have you on the program as always. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Shari.